Jeff, I'd like to talk with you a little bit about moral decision-making, and especially from the viewpoint of church teaching and the long Christian tradition and how that guides us. Obviously, moral decision-making is a difficult matter. A lot of times it is clear-cut what we should do. We shouldn't steal from people, and a lot of times we realize that. We really shouldn't hurt people's reputation. No, there's a lot of clear imperatives, it seems to me, in life when we just know what we should do or not do in a given situation. But there's also gray areas that are often very difficult, and maybe there's a way in which the tradition or the church teaching guides us. And as I move into this topic, I want to raise one of the problems immediately when you start talking about church teaching and church laws and so on. It's the great danger of what we know as legalism. Legalism is an approach to moral decision-making that says, well, just tell me what the law is and then I follow it. And that we work up a law for every situation, and your job is simply to be sort of passive and obedient to that law. Legalism very often has been critiqued because it is minimalistic, because people say, well, if you just are keeping a law, then you miss the generosity of the gospel. You're walking around saying, well, what can I get away with? And what's the minimum amount I can do before I have committed a sin? So legalism has been a great problem in moral decision-making, and I'd like to just stay with that for a minute here.
The other problem with legalism, it seems to me, is that the question arises, is something right or wrong because the church says it's right or wrong, or is it right or wrong and then the church talks about it out of discovering legalism fails to root morality in reality. It lives up there in the sky someplace. Right and wrong descend from holy people who say the holy things to us. And the danger is that people who are living day-to-day existences may or may not see the way that ties into the way that they live. So legalism takes morality away from reality, as far as I'm concerned.
Yes, and the interesting thing about that is that in our Catholic tradition, we have been so big on what we call the natural law, which has a very healthy side to it, and it's fundamentally that morality is rooted in reality, as you said, that our belief is that God has put an intelligible structure into the world, that there is an ordered system that God has set up, and that it's possible for human intelligence to understand something about that system and to figure out ways to live in accord with it, and also to be conscious of ways in which we can be out of harmony with that structure. So that the Catholic tradition's been very big on natural law, and yet at the same time we've often been accused of being legalistic. And as a matter of fact, very often individual Catholics have sort of been dominated by a legalistic approach to moral decision-making. But there is a critique of it, I think, as you suggest, built right into our great Catholic heritage.
I think we become legalistic when there's a certain humility that you have to hang on to if you're going to use the natural law approach. That I think the claim is right that there's an order built into creation and into human living, but it's fraught with these gray areas. We can discern some things and find some general directions. I mean, Thomas Aquinas had a wonderful sense of this, that we're all going to agree when we say, should we do good and avoid evil? Everybody says yes. And then we get to a second level and says, well, how about the Ten Commandments? And everybody says, yeah, I like those too. So, now, how about applying a commandment to this particular circumstance? And then theologians are like economists. If you get 10 of them in a room and ask a question, you get 15 different answers. Because applying things to specific cases, there's an awful lot of gray there, and that's where it's difficult.
Sure. Just to follow through in your example, you would have people saying, yeah, do good and avoid evil. I agree with that. Yes, thou shalt not kill. Fifth commandment. I agree with that. Should you be in favor of capital punishment or not? Now we got a division right to that point. We were great till that point. We had agreement. Now we have disagreement because you'll have some people reading their scriptures and saying yes to capital punishment and that we need it to safeguard society. You have other people looking at the ethic of Jesus and saying no, that capital punishment shouldn't be our part of our public policy. So that sort of, I think, exemplifies the very point you're making. As the morality gets more concrete, specific questions, it becomes more complex and harder to follow. And in fact, St. Thomas Aquinas, who you talked about, had a famous saying that law applies in most cases, ut in pluribus in the Latin. For the most part, law applies. But also, he was very conscious of the great virtue of epikeia. He got that from the Greek world. The great virtue of epikeia was to know and have prudent judgment. It's a part of the virtue of prudence, to know when one ought not follow the law, have the wisdom to say, no, the law doesn't apply here. There's a law that you should go to Mass on Sunday, but my spouse is sick today and needs my attention. Therefore, I make a decision that I will not follow the law here. I will attend to my sick spouse. I base that on the law of charity, which is always higher than the particular law of the church to go to Mass on Sunday.
The whole notion of virtues, I think, stands at the heart of things for me. Again, we talk about moral decision-making, and people talk about making individual decisions, but we don't often talk enough about what it means to grow in virtue. And it's a word that's kind of fallen into disuse because it seems. But
it's a valuable part of the recovery that we're seeing in moral theology today, and I think that you're right, and you could go a whole hour on just that, the development of virtue and so on. I think it's absolutely crucial. But and it is one way around this legalistic problem. When I think of the legalism, I think of my teacher, Father Bernard Herring. I studied under him. He's one of the great moral theologians in the 20th century, maybe the greatest, and very holy man himself. He was in the Second World War, and he was involved in great patriotic efforts and saving people and so on, spreading peace even in the middle of the war. He gave Pope Paul VI his first retreat, and was a very influential figure at the Second Vatican Council. Well, Father Herring spent his whole life, as he said, fighting legalism. And that was his passion. I mean, when we went into his class, we knew we were going to get an anti-legalism diatribe no matter what the topic was. It didn't matter. I remember one day the question was raised, should we have married priests or not? And so the person asked Father Herring this question, well, should we let priests be married? Should we have mandatory celibacy or optional celibacy? He said, he says, here's what I think we should do. He says, we can't just change it like this quickly on the church because people won't be ready for it. We've got to go at it gradually. That's the way we'll do it. We'll go gradually. Here's what we'll do. We'll ordain married men. So you got these good married men in the community, and we'll ordain them. And then they'll function in the community. Yeah, that's what we should do. We'll ordain doctors, and we'll ordain engineers, and we'll ordain lawyers. But not too many of those. This is my favorite Bernard Herring story about legalism. It didn't matter what the topic was. We were going to avoid legalism. And of course, his positive thrust was to say, what you've got to do is have a generous following of the Lord, not just a minimalistic approach to this, and as you suggested before, an ethic that's really rooted in reality and not just in some arbitrary law. So we've got this, and I think that while Father Herring spent his life fighting that, it still persists. I mean, we still meet people, and there's still people who are in that stage. And you know why, I think? Because you can't avoid it. You grow up with legalism. You don't tell a little kid, you can't explain to him why he shouldn't go into the street in all detail, but you tell him don't run into the street. That's a law in this family. You don't do that. And so, in a sense, we're all legalistic as we grow up. I mean, we can't understand the reason for all laws, but they're there and we try to follow them. So, therefore, every new generation has to grow out of legalism, whether they learn it from the nuns in school or the priests in the homilies. It doesn't matter. It's part of your psychic makeup when you're little, and somehow you have to grow to adulthood and find a deeper way of making moral decision-making.
I also run into people who are maybe at the other end of the spectrum, who... I remember having a conversation with a friend not long ago who said, he was talking about people sleeping together who weren't married before they were married. And he said, well, if it's wrong, it's not because the stupid Catholic Church says that it's wrong. And in a sense, he wanted to throw all the rules out. And it bothered me. It bothered me, and I find myself feeling very defensive. That I think that there's a wisdom to the rules, and that they're very helpful, but precisely because they point to values. And as we talked, he and I found a middle ground there. But he was reacting against the legalism that he grew up with as a young Catholic boy. Here are all the rules. You got to memorize all these rules. And as he grew, they didn't all fit the reality that he ran into. And so he threw all the rules away. And now you kind of find your own way, kind of groping in the darkness. And you have to reinvent the wheel morally. And while adolescents insist on doing that, God knows I did, it's not very helpful ultimately.
Right. Yeah, and you miss what you point out so well, I think, is the wisdom of the church. What you're describing, I think, is what some people have called a total relativism, where there are no clear absolute values even, or absolute principles to follow. Everything is relativistic. That is, you feel this way, I feel this way. There's no way to adjudicate those different claims, no way to make a judgment that your insight into this moral situation is better than mine. I feel this way, you feel that way. Well, there's no place to go from there. I mean, you get a parents and a teenage boy having a discussion, and there's no way to solve the problem. Well, the older generation feels this way, the younger one feels that way. And I think that really messes us up. It really puts us in a bad position.
Truth and good become matters of taste, essentially. And it's part of our American individualism, that you really can't impose anything on anybody else. But in reality, the choices that we all make do impose on one another. They do have an effect.
Sure.
They do.
I mean, we can usually draw the line as something like rape. I mean, we can say, well, one guy likes to help poor people, another guy likes to rape women. I mean, you just can't say that. I mean, even in certain circles, enlightened liberal circles who appear to be relativistic in many ways and want to throw out the church's teaching and tradition, if you bring up that kind of example, I mean, not too many people are willing to just say, well, oh yeah, that guy's into rape, that's fine, that's his thing. I mean, it's silly, it's crazy. I mean, because you got women being hurt and fearful, and it's a horrible thing. So you right away, your intuition tells you that isn't right. You've got some values, and so there's a value or a general principle at stake here. Don't hurt other people. You can't use whatever your inclinations happen to be and follow them if they're going to hurt other people. So now we got a principle, a value that we have to try to uphold. And eventually we make a law about that. And we say, well, you're going to put rapists in jail because they're a harm to society.
There's a great difference between, earlier in our conversation we talked about Thomas Aquinas saying that we're going to have to argue when we talk about particulars. There's a difference between that and this relativism that you talked about, because the previous one, Thomas Aquinas is understanding there's a truth and a good out there that we struggle toward, and we only apprehend it little bit by little bit, and that's why we argue. There's a difference between saying there's a right and a good and a true that we need to discover, and saying that, well, this is good for me and that's good for you. They're two very, very different things. The one, again, we're back to it's grounded in the reality of our world.
And the Thomistic insight, I think, is really valuable because it's got a developmental character to it. As you point out, it's the role of intelligence and the role of the faith community to keep trying to discern what the eternal law is. That's part of his language again, and how that's manifested in what we call the natural law, what reason can apprehend. So that you try to put all that together in a synthesis, and I think it is more palatable to our relativistic friends and the people who have sort of rejected church teaching out of hand to put it in that dynamic framework. That is human intelligence, guided by the religious traditions. I don't think anybody needs to rule that out, or I don't know why anyone wants to rule it out, because very often there's wisdom in that, is gradually trying to discern exactly how you live in accord with reality. How do you live best to maximize the well-being of the human community?
I think there's a great deal of agreement between this sort of natural law approach and the scriptures. You know, I in the Bible itself, the best approaches to sexual morality that I've ever found is in Proverbs, where the father says to the son, and it's a larger allegorical sort of thing, stay away from somebody else's wife. Why? Because it's stupid. You're going to get killed. He's going to want more than, if you sleep with a prostitute, you pay her with a loaf of bread and you're done. But if you take somebody else's wife, you can't ever pay that debt off. The door to her house is opens to Hades, to hell. You're gone. Mm-hmm. It's stupid. Don't do it. This is a wonderful approach to sexual morality. Well, is it biblical? Well, sure it is. There's a great deal of agreement there because the scriptures and their writing and their inspiration grow out of the everyday experience of the Jewish people.
And I think what we have to insist on here is the point you made before, and that is as the church tries to formulate guidelines for the members of the church and offer wisdom and so on, it is the church's attempt to sort of codify or to put into a principle or into a law a wisdom that she's gained from looking at Christ, looking at the Scriptures, and trying to live it out in the everyday world. So I think if we see church laws or moral teaching that we find in the church as a distillation of the wisdom of the community, I think then we begin to be able to apply it in better fashion. I mean, you just take the area of sexual morality that you raised there. I mean, there's a clear wisdom in the Christian tradition that says that the act of intercourse should be carried out within the marriage framework, where there's fidelity and permanency and a community created where children can be raised and so on. Well, you can say, well, that's old stuff and so on. Well, but it isn't, because there's the wisdom there is really can guide us today. And when the wisdom isn't followed, we have problems. We have people getting pregnant who don't want to be pregnant. Then we have people getting abortions and having post-abortion syndrome afterwards and feeling terribly guilty. And we have, unborn humans being harmed. And we have relationships breaking up. And after one person said, I've given myself to you totally, and now you've rejected it. So you begin to look at the way life is lived out and you say, aha, there is a wisdom here. Things don't go so well with human beings when this distilled wisdom is followed. So it's not an arbitrary thing like saying, well, no sex for anybody. We're going to deny pleasure to people and so on, and it's only allowed in certain circumstances and so on. No, I think there's a larger wisdom here that associates sexuality with relationship, with fidelity, with the permanency that we associate with marriage.
There's something about sexual expression. Timothy O'Connell was here several years ago and lectured at UT. He said there's something about it that always says more. It's not simply once is enough for today, but we'll get together and we'll do this again. It's always future oriented. It's always open to another experience, and it has so many different meanings, and it has to be. I hate the word protected because I think our sexuality is a strong thing, but sexual expression has to exist within a framework for it to have meaning, for it to say what it's supposed to say.
And that's what the church tradition is saying. That's what the wisdom of the church is in this regard. So what we're trying to do, Jeff, here is I think get a positive sense of church teaching guiding us. We've chosen the area of sexual morality there, and it says things like, thou shalt not commit adultery. Church makes that injunction of the Hebrew Scriptures its own. It tries to build up marriage, fidelity, permanency in marriage, and so doing, I think, enriches the culture and keeps us on our toes in a sense, so we don't simply buy into hedonism or into a cultural relativism that says do your own thing and whatever feels good is right. So that we don't leave people adrift. I remember sort of kidding around at collegians coming in, and Joseph Fletcher, who wrote a book called Situation Ethics, and Fletcher's fundamental point was that in any situation you should do the loving thing. And as Bernard Herring used to say in class, that for Joseph Fletcher, love is a sphinx. And what he meant was that love had no clear countenance, no clear face. It had no content. So if collegians going together and wondering about premarital sex come into me and seeking advice, and I say, well, we'll follow Joseph Fletcher, do the loving thing. Well, I haven't really helped them. I haven't given them any real guidance. What Herring would want to say, no, what you got to do is help people understand what love is all about and how sexuality relates to love and what value permanency and commitment and fidelity have in the whole situation.
It helps us to reformulate the question, where the question when I was in high school was, how far can you go before it's a sin? Once you've asked that question, you're already in trouble. It's a wrong question. When you ask bad questions, you get bad answers. The good question is, in the context of Christian belief, is how can I use my sexuality as a larger thing than doing this or doing that? How can I use my sexuality to help me to grow as a person and to form good, solid relationships with other people? Then it becomes a positive force and you recognize that when you act out with other people in lots of different ways, your sexuality is always a part of that. And that's why back to virtues again, the virtue of chastity is really honesty in our sexual relationships. If you ask people, well, should we be honest? Yeah, it's good to be honest. Well, chastity is being honest in our sexual relationships, to say what we mean. A handshake, a kiss, an embrace, intercourse, those all say different things to different folks, and to be used in their proper context, they really say something. They have immense power.
Our young people really do have a good understanding of this, I think. They have a good sense that one ought to be truthful in relationships. Like everyone else, they can't always follow that, but that's a message that they understand. And I think they also can be shown that sexuality is a language. It's a way of expression. It's always symbolic. It's saying something more. And therefore, they can see a way in which there ought to be truthfulness connected with it, integrity. So, I mean, I really think that is a good way to argue. And what it highlights, again, is that if you simply come at the church tradition, whatever the church has to offer us, as, well, it's got a bunch of rules, and you follow them, then you miss the point. What the church has got is a wisdom. It's a wisdom about human life that can really guide us and that we ignore at our own peril. I think if you can come at it that way, and we're centered on sexuality here, but we could go to any kind of question, social justice, anything else, there's a wisdom in the long Christian tradition that we really can draw on and can guide us.
I think especially something you said a minute ago triggered something. Young people who are trying to do what the best thing to be truthful in their relationships, and they don't always, like everybody else. I think there's often a stigma now. Well, I'm horrible, or I'm bad, or I'm evil. Say, no, you made a mistake, and you recognize that it's a mistake. You say, now how can we start over? How can we go in another direction?
That's part of the church's wisdom, too, I think, that we draw on it. There's a merciful God who's involved in this process with us, who's on our side, who wants us to make progress, and who is always ready to forgive us, to wipe the slate clean and offer us another chance. So the wisdom that calls for a generous response also speaks to us of a God who's with us every step of the way and ready to forgive our sinfulness and deal with our limitations.
The sacrament of reconciliation can be very helpful in as much as it's never magic. I did this wrong thing and I confessed it, so I'm never going to do it again. No, we're going to try to move in a new and a better direction. And I think sometimes people get frustrated because they find themselves doing the same stupid thing and again. But it's very much like medicine over a long period of time. It's a treatment that's part of a whole barrage of things that you need to do, which I'm going to keep trying. I'm going to keep recognizing that this is a problem, and together God's going to stand with me, and we're going to move beyond it.
It's a very healthy position because it offers the possibility of growth and development, which is part of what the moral life is all about. So the church's wisdom should be guiding us in all of this.
Perfection, I think, is part of the resurrection. It's something we move toward. Be perfected as your Father is perfect.
Yes.
And for people to be perfect immediately on the point of conversion to Christian faith is unrealistic.
See, and that's why I think we must guard against this legalism in the church, because as soon as you got a legalism, you got no way around it. You're going to end up in either self-righteousness or some sort of perfectionism. The laws are minimal, and I kept them all, therefore I'm great. Or I take the ethic of the gospel and say I can't ever live up to that, and it's terrible, so I'm really no good. There doesn't seem to be any good way out of it. In a developmental framework, a God who calls us by name and asks us to take a step forward, and a church that guides us in the process, you got a chance of keeping a healthy perspective and where we keep trying, meeting the challenges and so on.
And it's a lifelong process. I don't know. I'm going to be 40 next week. I have no fantasy that I've put this all together for myself, and I don't know many people who probably have in an absolute kind of way. But along the way, we grow and we become a little more wise, and there are things to do and things to avoid. And frankly, as the years have gone by, the wisdom of what the church teaches has become more apparent to me. It wasn't immediately obvious when I was
right. And I think there's a general problem with young people is that they think they're the first ones to ever have encountered a problem, and they have to rethink it, and there isn't any wisdom. And I think that's a natural tendency, and maybe in the modern world we all are tinged with that in one way or another. But I think that what we want to get at here is that we really aren't alone. We're social creatures. We're interdependent. We live in a community, and that church community really can help us. It can help us in the area of sexual morality, but also in personal ethics in terms of honesty and fidelity. The wisdom can help us in social ethics and guide us to be more attentive to those who are in need. And it's always a generous response that the church's teaching directs us towards, although one has to see that in terms of wisdom and not a strict law.
And it works if you say, in my experience, this is what's happened. And we can do that in a lot of areas in our lives. I do that with my kids. I don't tell them much about, I don't have a lot of sexual experience, but I don't use that as in my experience, people use other people. Those questions, they're still very young. Those are going to come up. And if I have the guts to use that stuff to say, in my experience, and in a sense, that's what the church is saying, in our experience, but it's easier for parents and teachers to externalize that because you're much less vulnerable. You say, well, the church says to do this. No. It's those guys over there. Those are the laws. Now we have to do that. But if I take responsibility for my own position in the church as part of the community and say, it is our community's experience that when this happens, people are hurt. When this happens, people are healed and made better. I think we become much more credible.
That personalistic context that you just used there, I think, is very helpful. In other words, what we would end up wanting to say is that the church is the friend of humanity, that the church wants to guide the human community forward. It wants humanity to reach its full potential. It's not a drag, and it's not trying to make life difficult. It's trying to find the potential there and draw it out. And I think that has a very different feel to it, that the church is a friend. It's on our side. And so now sometimes, there might be particular things said by church leadership that people disagree with, and that raises the whole question of dissent, and we really don't have time to get into that. But I want to see it as a friendly guide along the path of life.
And it makes the whole process much more dialogic in that it's not the church, things falling out of the sky that we're going to give to humankind, but rather as the church, as the whole human community walks together, we've noticed that the things that the human community knows and teaches, we've picked this up, and we want to reflect this back to you from the way that we all live together. Life will be better if we do this. What do you think? And again, back to natural law, we tend to say, address ourselves these days to all people of goodwill. We're not simply talking to Catholics or to Christians or to Westerners.
Well, Jeff, we've been talking here about moral decision-making and the role of the church, and we've tried to move beyond legalism that says just follow the law to a generous response. And our great claim has been the church has a wisdom in many areas of life and in all of the human strivings. The church has something to say. We might listen to it critically and try to weigh it into our moral decision-making.